Hi, everyone. Tanya here with Closing the Gap, a social justice podcast, where we talk about ways that interrelated problems like social, racial, gender, climate justice, you name it, how they all come together and how we can work on the solutions for all of them. Because we know that when we work towards the solutions as a whole and as individuals, we can collectively heal and overcome these problems. And when we do that, we can all improve as a society, which is definitely the goal, that we can live in a more equitable and just peaceful world. So I am super excited for today's episode. I'm definitely biased because the person today I met during my undergrad, we were both studying psychology together. So if y'all didn't know, I was planning to be a psychologist and Sergio was living my dream that I did not achieve, but he is doing it way better than I would have ever. So I'm just glad that he's going to share his story and the importance of not only having representation in psychology, but what that means in different ways. And I think it is something that mental health is becoming more big, but we don't necessarily talk about how or why that impacts people. And so Sergio Maldonado, just a little intro. He's from Pomona, California, and that's where we went to school, Cal Poly Pomona. And he studied psychology there, but now he's at Purdue University in Indiana studying counseling psychology. And so he's going to graduate from there with a PhD. He's a very smart man and he's doing great things for the community. We can have both academics and community. So yes, thank you for being here, Sergio.
Thank you, Tanya and Adriana, for having me too. I'm actually excited for today's conversation.
Likewise. So I think where we can go ahead and get started is asking what inspired you to become a therapist? I know that that's why you're going to school. What was it that inspired you?
Yeah, so I will say that it wasn't like this. It was a very non-linear trajectory as far as how I decided to become a therapist and ultimately basically just major in counseling psychology. I didn't grow up with this idea of like, oh, I want to become a therapist and address people's concerns or trauma or things like that. Nothing like that. So basically, I started my higher education at a community college. I went to Moreno Valley College, and while I was in Moreno Valley College, I at the time I didn't even know what psychology really was. The only connotation I had about psychology was, very broad. Oh, the mind and crazy people and working with crazy people. That's basically how I grew up with that idea, but I had no idea that psychology was this umbrella term with so many fields or nothing like that. But I had to take a psychology class for my general education credits. And I took a class with a professor named Dr. Tolonai. She played a huge role, and she's one of the reasons why I actually got to grad school. So there was this one day after I was one of the co-founders of the psychology club in community college, along with her guidance and other friends. I went to go talk about basically the importance of getting involved. And towards the end, I mentioned what my goals were. And I said, after community college, I plan to transfer to a four-year university, get my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I'm going to use that degree as my plan B. My plan A is to get into the workforce. There was at one point in my lifetime where I'm going to get into law enforcement, and that's a different story as well. But I essentially said education is my plan B. And after that meeting, I recall to this day, like, me regañó. She came to me, pulled me to the side, and said, Sergio, like, no disrespect to law enforcement, nothing like that, but you cannot have education as a plan B. That should be your plan A.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the one who told me, because at that time, UC Berkeley was my dream school to transfer to. And she knew that, and she told me, you are UC Berkeley material, you are Stanford material, you are Harvard material, like you have the potential to exceed in all of these schools. And yo no me la quedé viendo, like, huh? Like, okay, I think you're just trying to hype me up because, you know me. But at the same time, after that, like, took the time and I'm like, well, she really doesn't know me. She only knows me from the classes. So it's not like, our family members who could potentially be biased and say, oh yeah, Mijo, you could do it, right? She really had no investment, so I'm like, damn, she really sees something in me. Through her mentorship, she would tell me and other friends, transfer out to a four-year university, whichever university you decide to go to, get involved in research, even if you don't know what research is. You go knock on Professor George and let them know, my name is X, Y, and Z, and I want to do research. You'll learn along the way. And then she said, because that's going to prepare you for graduate school, and no student is supposed to pay for a PhD program. So none of you guys are going to pay for a PhD program.
Oh,
And at that point, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about now? Research and PhD. So I'm like, yeah, sure, Dr. Tolonai, whatever you say. So when I transferred to Cal Poly Pomona, I learned about the McNair Scholars Program. They told me to introduce undergrads to research. And in my mind, I'm like, Dr. Tolonai said, get involved in research.
Yes, shout out to McNair. Shout out to programs. For those who don't know, McNair is a program that uplifts low-income people in colleges by you can do your research, but you get a stipend. And so Sergio and I were both part of it. We both did different research projects. You can do your own idea, which is pretty cool. And so like Sergio said, even if you don't know what research is, it's meant for people who maybe you don't even use it later. I don't research right now, but that's something that will probably stay with me the rest of my life because that's just how impactful it was. We had a lot of training sessions. So yes, great program. If you are in college and you want to get paid to do research and you're low income, you do have to apply.
Yeah. So then I applied for the program, got in. And during that time, they were telling us as part of the program, we were supposed to develop our own independent project. And during that time, there was a tragedy. One of our close friends from high school, he got murdered. It was deemed as a, gang related homicide. And so I remember getting, my brother got the call with my brother, and it was just a wild weekend. And after that, I was just reflecting on the different pathways that we have taken. I was reflecting on how my brother, to a certain extent, was still doing the things he used to do despite being incarcerated. And, I just started having so many questions, right? I wasn't even thinking about it as research. All I was thinking about was why is it that people could grow up in the same environment and still have different pathways. And like looking at my brother, looking at my friends, reflecting on myself, it's like we're not fully bad. We're not fully, the way that people may see us because of the decisions that we've made, but we have good things in us as well. So that basically led to a project that I did on gang desistance, which is basically the process of leaving a gang, but through a strength-based approach. So I basically interviewed people in LA who were gang affiliated and basically how they utilized their strengths to change their lifestyle, to basically for the betterment of themselves and their community and their families. And during those interviews, all of the people that I interviewed ended up being incarcerated, and they all talked about education, how they got into education while incarcerated. And some of them even conceptualized how education was key for their own healing, for some of their own traumas. And that was very impactful for me. And it just so happens that at Cal Poly, we had, one of my other mentors, Dr. Renford Rees, the founder of the Prison Education Project and the Reintegration Academy. I got involved with the Prison Education Project, also known as PEP. And we taught folks who were incarcerated in California, a variety of classes. And then that led to my involvement with the Reintegration Academy, which is a program for parolees, people who have paroled out of prison, and you kind of provide mentorship to them. And one of the things that I started noticing, though, was that in our conversations, and even from my own circle, I saw that a lot of people lacked interpersonal skills. They didn't know how to communicate. A lot of people still had a lot of, unresolved healing. A lot of it came from either multiple traumatic events, or just generational trauma that they hadn't healed. And so while many people were talking about how important it is to help formerly incarcerated people get jobs, get housing, get into, higher education, which I fully agree. No one was really talking about how once they get there to make sure that they maintain employment, that they stay in higher education. Because a lot of people, recidivism rates are very high. And although there are a lot of systemic issues, one of the reasons why recidivism is also high is because of unresolved trauma. And so while I was in undergrad, I said, you know what? I think this might be the thing going into counseling psychology, because some of our values as a counseling psychologist is we focus not only on the, remedial measures, meaning like therapy, but also preventative, trying to prevent problems. Our other value is being strength-based approach. Let's not just focus, for lack of a better word, on what's wrong, but also what's good about the person and utilizing their strengths to help them thrive, right? Not just address the problem, but see the person as a whole. And that's what drew me to the field of counseling psychology. I want to become a psychologist, but specifically a mental health psychologist, to become a therapist. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
It was all needed. There's a lot we can unpack there, but I'll kind of pick out a few nuggets that stuck out to me. You're already bringing up some of the barriers that people have towards mental health, incarceration being one, being in an environment that doesn't support that being one, and the stereotypes around getting mental health help. And I do think this is changing with younger generations. I feel like they are starting to see as therapy more like something everyone needs rather than crazy people, quote unquote. But I do think it's changing slowly, unfortunately. That's something I still see, especially in cultures that I think need it the most. Like, especially in immigrant cultures, that's just, you're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to we sacrifice everything to come here to the US. What do you mean you're depressed? Like, that's not a thing. Like, you need to get up and, go work. It's just not as talked about. And I do think that, like I said, it's starting to change, but not to the extent that maybe we would like it to. So I do think that's one barrier. But just with all the people that you've worked with the Prison Education Project, all these different programs that are trying to get more people educated and more people uplifted, what other barriers do you see we need to get through before we get there?
So there's definitely a lot. I mean, some of the most common barriers that people talk about, even in the research literature and all of that of what the most common barriers are, things tend to be like transportation. Sometimes people don't have transportation to get to a mental health, center, or if it's a private practice, they just don't have the transportation, the time. There are families, individuals that sometimes have to hold multiple jobs, have multiple responsibilities that it just doesn't allow them to go, economic hardships. As it is, even in urban communities, the scarcity of services, the availability of services are very limited. But in rural areas, like where I'm at, that is exacerbated even more, right? So even the lack of services. And in addition to the lack of services, I also want to add just even the lack of culturally competent providers. So one of the things that I've experienced, well, maybe not experienced, but that the people that I've worked with. So to preface, I'm currently, for the past 2 years, I've been providing services at a community corrections facility. Community corrections, basically what it is they hold folks who are in a work release program where they are technically still incarcerated, but they're allowed to leave the facility to basically to go to their, to their jobs for employment. And then also with folks who are in in-home detention. So that's where I provide services. I also provide services at a manufacturing company. It's one of the most diverse places that I've been in. You have refugees and immigrants from Burmese, from La República Dominicana, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Guatemala, a lot of countries in Central America, a lot of Mexicans, and also, a lot of white people who are economically marginalized, like rural Indiana. And so I've had clients come and tell me, and I recently had two who said, I'll keep it PG, but they said basically screw therapy. This shit doesn't work and this and that. But HR basically said that, this is the place I got sent to because of these panic attacks that I'm having, or because they lashed out at work. And so the HR managers that I work with, they're phenomenal. They don't just fire people right off the bat. They do try to, work things out. And so with me being the on-site therapist, sometimes they send me team members. But one of the things that they said is they've shared with me their experiences in therapy for those who have gone. And it's like their experiences are horrible. I've heard of therapists falling asleep on them. I've heard of therapists who basically come in kind of like with their own agenda of like, no, this is your problem. And it's like without necessarily trying to get to know the person. So them already kind of imposing their own biases or judgments. And so when I say the lack of culturally competent providers, I use that term very vaguely, broadly to basically just describe therapists who don't do the work to check their own biases, to check their own attitude, to check their own judgments, because we all have them. I have them. The difference is that I get challenged every week by my supervisor to examine those biases and those judgments. How is this impacting my work with this person? Why did I get a reaction when this person said this? I think to me, that's the one that has been like the most salient to me right now, is that we all know, right, that all these barriers exist. But I feel like there's a lack of training and the lack of therapists to continue their training. Because just because you become a therapist and you get your degree and your license, the work doesn't stop there. Learning is a lifelong process. And so that is what sometimes discourages people to even go. All it takes is one experience for them to generalize what therapy is.
You're hitting so many good points right now, and it's hitting so close to home. I'm really happy we're having this conversation. Me personally, I have also been looking into therapy, and I've experienced the exact same thing as your clients, where I had a therapist who was a little bit older, and I could tell her methods they're outdated. And I quit after like 3 sessions because I saw it wasn't helping me whatsoever. I just love that you're stressing the importance of constantly learning, constantly changing your methods, because, generations change.
Mm-hmm.
The generation now, the youth is so different from what our parents' generation looks like. And it's important to learn how to talk to them and also understand the issues that they're dealing with that other generations might not have dealt with before. I also can just tell, just from your background, you're very relatable to a lot of these communities that are seeking this help. And I think it's very important that therapists are as diverse as the clients that they're trying to help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so with that, Adriana, thank you just for even sharing about your experience with seeking therapy. The second point that I was going to get to was about like the stigma about therapy. And I didn't realize how embedded that stigma was even within me. When I was in undergrad, I was going through some issues where it got to the point that my drinking got out of hand. I was essentially even skipping class. My morning classes, I would be at shout out to the Pomona Brewery, brewer, but I would be there like at 10.
Sponsor the episode.
Yeah. But I was, there were some times where I was there at 10 in the morning when they were just open and I would be drinking. And I recall one of my mentors in undergrad told me, Sergio, go to therapy. See it as a learning opportunity, not only to address whatever conditions you're going through, but as a therapist in training is going to help you to understand what it's like to be on the other side. But I've always been, theoretical, stubborn. And I'm like, yeah, I'll go. And then I would always make the excuse, long wait list. But I wouldn't even try to get on, to seek services. I got to Purdue, year 3 in, still hadn't gone. I didn't go to therapy until last year for the first time ever. And even when I was providing services at Purdue in our training clinic, I realized that I wouldn't even tell students, oh, what brings you to therapy? Because to me, saying what brings you to therapy, I automatically assume something's wrong with you. So what I would say instead was, oh, so what brings you to the PCGC? Because the PCGC is the acronym for the Purdue Guidance and Counseling Center. And I would never use the words therapy or nothing like that. And I used to say, oh, I don't want my clients to internalize it. But no, it was my own shit. And it wasn't until I was willing to really break that down with my two supervisors that I realized, holy crap, like this is really the stigma behind seeking help is really embedded in me and is very problematic as a therapist. And so as I finally decided to go to therapy and I had, even an incident with my therapist at the time where we clashed heads. So there's a lot of person like you, Adriana, who felt like, what, it doesn't work, right? And I completely agree. Sometimes a therapist style is not going to match what you need. And what I would tell folks is I would encourage them to empower themselves to actually have those conversations in the first session or in the consultation meeting of like, how do you work? Tell me about your approach, your style. These are my boundaries. And that's something that I open up with. I think part of it has to do with my approach where I try to minimize my power as a therapist because there's power dynamics that exist. Whether I want to admit it or not, they see me as a therapist. So there's some power dynamics there, but I try to minimize it as much as possible. In every session, I always tell people, I'm not the expert. You are. And this is how I see therapy. This is how I conceptualize it and tell me about what are your boundaries. When I work with women, specifically women who they're survivors of some type of violence, whether it's childhood, abuse, domestic violence, whatever it may be, that's one of the things that I say right off the bat. Look, I acknowledge, I'm a man. How is it for you to work with another man? And what can we do to, address it? Or if we can't, and you feel uncomfortable, we could refer you out. That's fine. It's kind of like, being empowered to have those questions or have those conversations even with the therapist. Like, hey, this is not working. And just to give an example, my therapist, it was my second session or third, and they told me, oh, yeah, basically that I might be experiencing depression. And they talked about medication. That was a hot button for me right off the bat because I have my things with medication. Not to say it's all bad. I understand some people may need it. And I told her I had a reaction. And then they had a reaction to my reaction. And, it got almost, I felt like it was an argument that we were having where they were trying to justify why medication is not bad. And it's like, okay, now you're making it up by yourself. And we ended that session. I left pissed. So the following week, I told her, look, I want to address what happened last week because I'm bothered by it. And this is why I'm bothered. We've only been working for 3 sessions and you're already talking about medication. I feel like you're giving up on me. How can you tell that I need medication if it's only been the 3rd session? And so what we came to this basically agreement that if we continued working and if by the 12th session they didn't see any progress, okay, let's revisit the conversation about medication. But until then, you cannot tell me that after 3 sessions, oh, you need medication. But that was a very difficult conversation. Oftentimes people would be like, you know what, F this, not going back, which I completely understand why someone would do that, especially when there's a financial component to it. Why am I spending so much money on someone who just wants to medicate me and whatnot? I completely get that. But to me, I also saw that as a growth opportunity. How to have a difficult conversation with someone.
Thank you for sharing that experience with us. Yeah, I understand it's not always the easiest to share it, but as Adriana shared as well, just so our listeners know, I actually just started therapy 4 months ago for my first time. And also as someone who studied psychology, you would think it would have been a lot sooner, but it wasn't. I will say the reason I started is because with my current insurance, it's free if I do it through an app called Babylon. And I will put that in the show notes because if it's free for others, please try it. So that kind of cut some of the barriers that you were mentioning, like transportation. I don't need to worry about that on my phone. Financial component, I don't need to worry about that either because it's free under my insurance, which of course isn't for everyone. And of course, that's an issue. So I love that the work that you're doing now on site, on where people work, and the company is providing them, they're sending them. So the company is paying for it, I'm assuming. So that's really important. That's what we need more of. We need companies to support their workers. And we think of health benefits as physical health benefits, but this is health as well. And so we should expect companies to be a part of it. So I like that you touched on that, like personal barriers, not only overcoming that idea that therapy isn't for me, I'm not sick or I'm not whatever, so I shouldn't have to do it, but also how we should expect our workplaces and if you're a student, your schools to provide that. So there's a lot of barriers I'm glad that you're addressing just by the work that you're doing. But kind of switching gears, you kind of already touched on it a little bit, but we already discussed kind of barriers to us as people, as patients, clients, people who go to therapy. But as a therapist, were there barriers that you had becoming that? Because if we do want more culturally competent therapists, then we have to make sure that we can get more Latinos, Asians, Black people, queer people, you name it, into therapy, right? We have to make sure they make it all the way to grad school. So yeah, what do you feel like there are barriers there for people who maybe don't even know what research is, like you mentioned? Like how can people even start that journey?
Yeah. I mean, as far as like versus becoming a therapist, I don't want to say this like barrier, but I remember that when I was applying for graduate school, when I was still at Cal Poly, I remember having a conversation with, my parents about what I wanted to do. Because my mom kept on asking me, why are you leaving California? She didn't, choose the idea like there's a bunch of schools in California, great schools. My parents right now, they currently live in the city of Paris in Riverside County. So she'll tell me UCR is down the street. Why do you have to go to a different state? And so I started, this is when I realized the importance of even us students who, identify themselves as first generation, who talk about they're the first one in their family going to college and their parents didn't know or still don't know what college is about. Having these conversations with them of what that actually is about. Because I remember I invited my parents once to one of the award ceremonies for the Kellogg Fellow Discovery Program, something that had launched at Cal Poly. And my mom was so excited, but she didn't know exactly what it was. She just, oh, my son is getting an award. And my mom was told me, I feel bad that I don't know what exactly is that you do. People at work ask me, and I just say, oh yeah, my son is going to college, but I don't know what it is that they do. I don't know what your aspirations are. And there was a night that I was talking with both of them, and I mentioned, I'm gonna get my PhD in counseling psychology. And so I completely understand where they were coming from, but he asked, why that? Because my dad began to tell me about how, he has a primo and in Mexico that was a psicólogo too, and he doesn't make much money. So to them, it was, that financial piece. Can you even get a job with that? And he was talking about how difficult it was in Mexico to get employed as a psychologist. So I had to explain to him the US is different than Mexico. There are, and there are different ways that you could utilize this degree for. So having that conversation. And then my mom, having to talk about like, again, even why do you want to work with crazy people or why in prisons? Because she knew that I would go into prisons. And so my mom also, she had all these biases towards people who were in prison. And I remember telling her, well, mom, wasn't your son also in prison? And so, having those hard conversations about how like, that your son is in this, dangerous felon, because of the crime that he committed. And so just having those conversations. And so then it was always why psychology? What are you going to do with it? And I remember that I would start ignoring them. And I was getting irritated and mad towards them, like, man, just leave me alone. But then again, it was about me going back and having that conversation with them to kind of like just clear the air y darles un poco de paz and letting them know, like, I'm going to be fine. Like, I'm not going to be unemployed because I know my parents have always navigated life on survival mode, which I completely, understand. And so I had to have those conversations with them of like, I'm not going to be on survival mode all the time because that was their main concern. And so it was a little bit about that of just how they saw therapy. And it's something that I see with the communities I serve here. So this is kind of backtracking to like the stigma. And I feel it's just important to address real quick. So the way that I've been trying to destigmatize therapy is by one, addressing the power dynamics that I just mentioned. As a therapist, I'm not the expert. because I don't know your life and I'm never going to know what it was like for you to navigate life through your lens or your experiences. You are the expert in that. All I'm bringing to the table is some general or maybe more specific knowledge on broader topics, like what trauma is. This is what trauma is. This is how it could manifest. So based on your story, how is trauma manifesting? How is it affecting your day-to-day life? Ultimately, you have the answers. Y es lo que le digo a todos. Like with a lot of la comunidad latina, I tell them, do you have a compadre or a comadre that you like talking to? Yes, okay. When you're having a bad day, when your husband or your son, gets you on your nerves, what do? You talk to your comadre, or what do guys do? Oh, you go with your compadre and you talk to them. That's all therapy is about, is having conversations. And so I try to frame it as just simple conversations. We're just having a conversation about, okay, just tell me about why is it you're stressed out about work? Oh, my coworker says, okay, what is it? Tell me about your relation with your coworker. And then from there, just breaking things down. As a therapist, yes, we have the skills on how to facilitate the conversations and then to explain what the distress might actually be. Is it anxiety? Maybe it's depression, or maybe it's just symptoms of depression, but you haven't fully developed depression. You may be having a manic episode. And so it's basically that, right? And so that's what I had to basically also do with my parents, was breaking it down to destigmatize it, to make it seem, look, therapy is not bad. It's not this taboo thing where you have to throw all of your family's business out there, because you don't. You hold the power to and the agency to decide what you want to share. And that's just the way that I work. And so that has been useful. And so as far as me becoming a therapist, that was one of the challenges. Was, I guess, in a way, I was looking for my family to accept what I was doing first, and then for them to see the importance of it, because they could have simply just accepted but not care about it. But I guess deep down, I wanted them to see the importance of it. And now I've gotten to a point with my family where they do see the importance of it. And so that has helped. The second thing, as far as becoming a therapist, was professionalism. I struggle with this so much because when I entered my program, I was the only Latino in the whole program. In a program of like 20 something students, only Latino, only person that spoke Spanish. And I felt like I couldn't express, communicate the way that I wanted. Secondly, we're like our worst critics. I don't have the most sophisticated vocabulary. So the other thing that I struggled with was trying to seem like I was intelligent by using sophisticated vocabulary. And I struggled with the image of what a therapist was supposed to look like. I had this imaginary image that a therapist was like a person in a suit who articulated himself very nicely. And there were times where I tried to do that, but I felt so off. And it wasn't until a supervisor, shout out to Dr. Pluskanka, she told me one day, Sergio, what the F are you doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, that's not you. Because in our training room, she would observe us while we work with clients. And she said, that's not the Sergio that I know. You are changing yourself. You have to bring in the Sergio, that goofy Sergio, the one that makes jokes, the one that connects with people. And so it was basically me trying to accept myself for who I actually am. And once I started doing that, oh man, my clinical work just did like a 180. I still struggle with some things, but for the most part, one of my biggest strengths that many people have pointed out has been like rapport building. For the most part, my therapeutic relationship is pretty strong with almost most of my clients. And so it was basically having to just erase that image of what a therapist is supposed to look like and bringing myself where I use slang. I speak in Spanish in my sessions. I use, dichos sometimes. I crack jokes with them, just being human in a way, basically, just being myself. So those were basically two of the barriers or challenges that I've encountered. But yeah, there's different ways. We have to reimagine how therapy should be looked like. And I think that's one of the issues that we lack imagination when talking about providing services.
I can't imagine a better way to end than that. Let's reimagine therapy. Let's reimagine what it means for each of us. And with that, I do want to emphasize how you said finding a therapist that their approach works for you, because you have worked, like you said, with so many different people. I can see that you're coming to each person as an individual, right? So you're making sure that each person has their needs met, rather than maybe like Adriana's experience where this lady, maybe that approach worked for other people, but clearly she was not listening to Adriana and what she needed. Yeah, thank you for just those like super important points that we will definitely highlight. And I did want to give you a chance to, you've already mentioned a lot of organizations and people that have mentored you, but I did want to give you a chance, since we're ending here, to either mention anyone that you haven't mentioned that has impacted you or that you think people should look into, or any of your other work that they can follow you. Yeah, see what you're up to and how to support you and your amazing work.
Right now, at the moment, it has definitely been my partner. Her challenging me in so many ways to basically, she's challenged me to self-reflect in my own behavior. That has gone a very long way because I've learned the importance of continuously to engage and just self-reflection. Currently, two of my friends in the program, Viviana Piceno, who is also from Cal Poly, and Stephanie Contreras, who is from Philly and the Bronx. But, even seeing them conceptualize their clients, like there are just so many things that I've taken, like seeing them as the badass clinicians that they are has been very like inspiring, as far as like these are considerations that I didn't even think of and whatnot. So in the clinical realm, I would say them three, even though my partner is not a therapist or nothing like that. She has helped me with a lot of like my own inner work that I had to do. But yeah, I mean, as far as like my work, unfortunately, I'm not the best writer. So there's 4 different studies that I've been working on. I still haven't published, but one of them has been on like the topic of gang desistance using a strength-based approach. That's my McNair project. I'll submit that by the end of this year. But I've also done work on like people's experiences in therapy for folks who are formerly incarcerated, and then on former lifers, people who were sentenced to life in prison, who have now paroled and are now in higher education, what their experiences have been. Those are like some of the current work that I have that hopefully by next year will be out. I do want to say, Tanya and Adriana, I've seen Tanya and I've seen her post about the podcast. And to me, it's been motivating and inspiring. Shows the fact that you two decided to, take the leap of starting this podcast and having conversations about these important issues. Earlier today, I had a conversation with my younger brother who's thinking of doing something similar. And I told him about me wanting to do something like this, but basically making videos for people that reflect my mom's population. Senoras who may not be as tech savvy, but just providing like mental health, psychoeducational videos in Spanish, because again, I want to make it more accessible. So those are some of the projects that I have, but hopefully I'll start posting soon on like LinkedIn.
I do encourage people to watch Sergio's other interview that he's had. And yeah, that's a lot of great stuff. I feel like you're working in different areas, but it's all connected. So that's what we love to talk about here, how everything's connected. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I need to go and process all of this because I feel like I already kind of knew what you were doing, but this is just a whole other level of how we can think about how we relate to one another, how we uplift mental health, and how we make sure that the systems that are in place actually change so we can have mental health wherever we are. My biggest takeaway personally was have those hard conversations. And I agree, we can't just like expect older generations to just change if we don't, have those harder conversations. And I do think those are good for us as well. Us youth can learn from what old generations have gone through. So yeah, thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for all of the work you're doing. You're greatly impacting your community. So thank you. Same thing. A lot of what you've mentioned today resonated so much, and I can't wait to reflect on it later. I hope it resonates well with our listeners too. We hope you all enjoyed this episode. Please follow us on whatever streaming platform you use. To learn more, you can follow us on Instagram at Closing the Gap Pod,
or email us at closingthegappod@gmail.com with questions and feedback. Thanks for listening. Until next time.